On the British Council present. Teaching English to visually impaired learners.
Session 3. The visual impaired learner in the classroom. Organization, materials, and activities.
Welcome everybody to this last session of the course. First, before we start with the whole session, I would like to make a brief overview of the main aspects and points that we are going to discuss throughout this last session. In this case, we are going to talk about the importance of the organization and how we adapt our physical space in our classroom. Then we introduce some different strategies and options of adapting materials and tasks relating to different linguistic skills. I will talk about the importance of making accessible the correction and the way we give feedback to our students. And finally, I would like to finish this session and this course giving you some teaching tips for when we face visually impaired students in our classroom.
Classroom layout and environment.
So we're going to start this session talking about classroom layout and environment and the importance of being organized in our physical space. So when we face the first time a visually impaired student in our classroom, we normally tend to think about how we can adapt documents and materials, but we sometimes forget about the importance of being organized and how we should make our classroom accessible as well for them. So here you've got some important aspects to take into account. As I said, there are some main points that we need to consider as it's the light. We need to think if our students need more natural or artificial light, as it might affect the way they see. And this will also probably will affect the seating plan of our classroom. We have to think about the position of the source of light towards our student or towards the document, the resources they're using, as I said, it can be annoying for them to have the light directly towards them, or maybe they need the light just above above them, or they need to be sitting down next to the window because they prefer natural light. It will depend on its impairment. Some other aspects we need to consider as well are that our students might need some gadgets or different accessories such as caps or glasses with filters that might help them to ease the vision and to make these gadgets or these accessories will make them feel more comfortable during the whole class. What you can see there in the image is a very typical lamp they use. It's called a flexible gooseneck lamp, and well, they can turn it on or off as depending on their type of activity we are doing, because as I said, sometimes they need extra light, and the source of light will depend on the on their activities, so they can move the light according to their necessities. So here you've got some important tips related to this, which is try to anticipate their needs. I have already said in session 1 the importance of talking and communicating to our students. One of these, one aspect that will be very relevant to talk in these preliminary meetings would be the way they need to be in the classroom. Lights and seating plan, of course, are some aspects to consider. And as I said, we need to talk and be flexible about these changes, because what is what they need in one day, they might not be comfortable with in another day. So we need to be flexible on this accessibility process. As I said, some other important aspects we need to take into account when we talk about the accessibility of our classroom are the following aspects. In this case, we're going to talk about the seating plan. And well, we have already discussed about the importance of where the light comes from, and this will for sure determine where our student will be seated, okay? Depending, as I said, on the window, or if they need artificial light to be just above them or towards them, it will depend. We need to talk as well here in this part about co-occurring disabilities. As we could see in session number 1, there might be students who suffer from other disabilities such as deaf blindness, and we need to think of their necessities. In this case, this will affect the place where they can sit. Maybe they need or they prefer to be seated on the right or on the left or of the space or the table because they can hear better. So it's important to know which ear they prefer to be, we can say, free of any disturbing element. About materials and tools, well, as we can see there in the previous sessions, the materials, documents, Perkins machines, all the material in general our visually impaired students use and need are very heavy and big, so we need to give them enough space to be comfortable and to give them the possibility to leave everything and have enough space, okay? So maybe we can think if there is enough space in our classroom to have like a complementary table for them to leave everything. And then if we are lucky enough to have the possibility of working with the students who are with guide dogs, well, we cannot forget these animals are working as well, and they need to be comfortable and they need to have their own space, okay? And well, about the organization of the classroom, we can talk about the importance of make all these spaces accessible for materials. So this means that every student has the possibility to stand up and take their books or leave their papers wherever they need. This is something very important to take into account, as we want our students to be autonomous and have the same responsibilities as the rest of the group. But for that, for making this a reality, we need to give them a lot of descriptive moments and situations where they can set all the elements of the class and where they can identify all the permanent and the established spaces for books or papers, whatever. We need to give them as well time to explore the class and set their own space and organization. And this is a very positive way to work cooperatively in class. As well, the rest of the group and the rest of the students can understand the importance of describing and giving time to visually impaired students in order to make them feel part of the group. We need to be very, very conscious about open windows, open doors, disorganized chairs, and books, wires, cables, everything that is not in their own place creates a feeling of disorientation and can make our students feel very frustrated, as they might feel lost. They normally tend to focus on knowing points or aspects in the classroom. So if we change anything in the classroom, we need to describe and we need to anticipate that change in order to make our low vision students well feel that they understand what is going on in the classroom. And of course, be very careful with windows or doors that are not properly closed, because it can be very well, it can be a damage, a danger for them.
Adapting tasks and materials.
We arrived to part of this session in which we are going to discuss more practically how can we adapt tasks and materials, and we're going to discuss these possible adaptations from the different linguistic skills, listening, speaking, reading, writing, and then we're going to add as well some more general examples related to vocabulary, grammar, and projects. However, before we start with the specific examples of listening, speaking, reading, and writing exercises, I would like to comment some more general aspects that are important to take into account when we are facing the adaptation process with visually impaired students. In this case, I would like you to think about the following statements and try to think if they are true or false, and I will comment it later. So the first one is, if the material used with visually impaired students need to be always tactile, if the information in the activities, the content we include in the activities may vary when we adapt the material, or if the objective of the task cannot change in any adaptation process. So I recommend you, before you move towards the next slide, think a couple of seconds on these statements. So as I have said, we are going to start talking about some general points that are important or relevant during the adapting process. And here you've got the answer to one of the statements that I previously presented to you, which is that our main goal when adapting material is that we need to keep the same objective as the rest of the group. The same objective in our adapting material than in the original material. However, the information or the content we include may be different, as we are going to see there is so much extra information that our visually impaired students cannot easily relate to the content or the activity itself, and it's not useful to include as well. Here you've got some general aspects that we need to understand. It's not only important to make bigger the image or to enlarge the document. However, we need to pay attention to the way the letters, the words are included. So it's important to focus on size and shape and think of if they are appropriate or not to our student. Then we also have a lot of activities in which images are related to the task. So we need to decide if those images are essential to the process of the learning process and the activity itself, or if they are just complementary images. If it happens that images are essential to understand the whole activity, we need to describe them, and we need to describe them in their mother tongue. This is sometimes controversial because we foreign language teachers try not to use the mother tongue in order to to be immersive, totally immersive in the foreign language. However, when we receive visual information, our brain decodes that information in our mother tongue. So it's fair that our visually impaired students receive that information as well in written text, but in their mother tongue. Well, it can also be orally, but I always recommend it to do it written so they can go back to the information and details of the image as many times as they need. We can also use, and they are very helpful to contextualize models, objects, realia. However, we need to check if those objects are totally related to the object in real life, and if the details are good enough to understand what we want them to understand. It's not only to give them the object, but we will need to describe the object. Okay, just to explain all the details. And finally, we have commented already the importance of being organized in our classroom, in our physical space, and is as important as what I have said, to be organized on the document in our papers, okay? We need to clearly state and clearly explain what are the objectives and what activities we want our students to do. Well, we have already explained the general aspects, the general points that we have to know and take into account when adapting a material. And in this case, we're going to start adapting listening tasks, okay? So before you move on to the next slide, please give yourself a couple of seconds to think, how would you adapt and what would you change from activity 8 and 9 that you can see on the left part of this book. Okay, so once you have thought about the possibilities of adapting this task, I'm going to show you which are the aspects that I would probably pay attention to. The first aspect would be if the images are related to the task objective or just complementary. In this case, we need to describe the images because if we don't have the information they show, we will not be able to do activity 9 in this case, okay? And not even activity 8 in which you have to talk about them also. So remember to describe them in the mother tongue and with many details as possible. Another aspect that I will pay attention to is if tasks with columns or matching words are accessible or not. I can tell you that even if we enlarge the image, this type of activity is not accessible because it tends to, it's really difficult for our low vision student to follow the line and not get distracted with the other lines. So it's much better to work with numbers and letters and just say 1B, for example, or 2D. So you match the same, but you don't need to literally paint a line. So yes, of course, we can leave them off the page. And finally, I would talk about the contrast and color just to check if it's accessible or not to our students, because there are a lot of difference of contrast between the background and the activities itself. So, well, I would just ask our low vision students if it's appropriate or not for them, for their necessities. Now we continue with an example of how to adapt speaking. In this case, we're going to do the same as in the previous slide. I recommend you to stop the recording to think of the possibilities of adapting and, well, any aspect you would change. I will comment how I would adapt this activity in the next slide. Okay, so although speaking activities might be very easy to adapt, as we just have to explain what we want our students to talk about, the truth is that sometimes we need images or we need other extra information to complete the task. And as you can see here, the speaking is part of a pre-listening activity, and I would like you to think of the two headsets that you can see at the top of the page. because, well, they are essential to the speaking. Unconsciously, they are giving us a lot of information with the green and red colors. They're dividing and classifying positive, negative expressions. And, well, for sure, there will be something I will comment and I will adapt. I will explain these positive or negative expressions are inside some head shapes. One is green, the other is red, and even I would just add as a complementary information that the green is related to a plant, the growing or the growth of a plant, and the other is related to the locker. However, at well, the back of these heads, we can see a ladder, and in this case, it's just complementary, so I wouldn't add information or description about this second image. As I said in the previous activity, I would check if the color and contrast of the images and activities presented are good when enlarging the activities. I would try to check if the information written on the heads are read, or the words are read by screen readers, because probably the screen reader will think it's an image and not a text. So students who work with the braille display probably will not get that information. And I will also check on the organization of the page. Visually, to non-visual visually impaired students, what we're going to read first probably would be the yellow square, the yellow table we've got in the middle of the paper. That tip that is very visually attracted to us will appear in the middle of the paper if we follow the order that it's presented in this paper. So it's not logical to have in the transcription or the adaptation of this document would be not logical to have that transcription or that to incorporate this just in the middle. I would do it at the beginning of the document for our visually impaired students have the same information at the beginning, because they are going to have less help than if we just with a quick look have that information. So, well, we have to check if the page follow the logical order, which in this case my opinion is that it doesn't follow that order. Okay, we arrive now to how can we adapt activities about reading and writing. And although we might think these activities are the easiest one to be adapted, the truth is that we need to focus on the type of activities related to their answers. Okay, so we have here some examples, such as the open question. In this case, when we work with low vision students, we need to pay attention on the space we give them to answer. It's not only that we make the enlargement of the question or the image, but we need to give them enough space to produce their own language. Another typical activity that we have is the true or false. They are normally presented within charts. And well, if we're working with totally blind students who work with screen readers, we need to check if they can read these charts with the screen readers. And if we are working with low vision students, we have to check if there is enough space for their answers. Apart from that, we need to take into account that even if the chart is accessible for computers and screen readers or braille display, If the chart is very complex, it's very difficult to follow the content. So anytime we want to use a chart, the easiest the design is the easiest is for the student to read it. Okay. And well, we've got finally another example, typical example related to reading activities, which is searching for words in text. Okay, more specifically when we have something related to something similar to look for a synonym of the word school in line 6. Okay, if we are making the enlargement of the text just as an image, it will probably continue being the line 6. But if we are making bigger the size of the letter, that line 6 will be totally different. And the same happens with Braille. Braille needs more space and lines are different. So instead of working with line, another option for this adaptation, for this activity, would be to work with paragraphs. So instead of saying, look for this word in line 6, I would say, look for this word in paragraph 1, because paragraphs are going to be always the same numbers independently on working with Braille or with paper. Okay, paragraphs are going to be always paragraphs. This time we're going to talk about how to adapt writing activities. So I recommend you again to stop the recording, think a couple of seconds, how would you adapt this and what things will be you will need to adapt. In this case, I'm going to talk about the following aspects. Is the text read by screen readers? Okay, in this specific case, we've got an email, the format of an email with an image and some bubbles that have different writing tips. So we need to check if the screen reader reads this as an image or as a text, because if it's read it as an image, they are not going to get the content. Okay, remember that if this happens, you will need to transcribe the text. Then another important aspect here in this specific example would be to the possible adaptation of the image. In this case, the image unconsciously is giving us a lot of information or difficult words that might appear in the text. Okay, so I would recommend to describe it with some details in order to relate the concepts that we've got in the text to the meaning in the image. Okay, so this will create a relation between difficult content, words, and their meaning. So I would definitely describe it in their mother tongue. Another important aspect here is that we are working with a writing text and we just can give the transcription of the text, but the truth is that it's presented as an email. So we need to describe how an email is. We need to work on the model, the format, the shape, and the organization. Okay, this will help to understand the process of writing an email in real life. So it's not only to transcribe the content, but to transcribe and describe the whole image, because in this case, it's the format is giving us a lot of information. And finally, I would pay attention to the written tips in the adjacent bubbles that we find in the left part, because it can happen the same with the screen readers if we are working with totally blind students. They need to get that information, and probably the Braille display or the screen reader gets that information as an image, so they will not be they will not have access to that tips. So you will need to transcribe it. And if we work with low vision students, I would personally try to enlarge only the image of the email itself, and I will somehow number the tips instead of writing lines or painting lines in the text, because it's easier for them to read the text and then separately read the tips. Sometimes when we find a line in the middle of the text, it can be very disturbing, and well, it's more difficult for them not get distracted by this type of strategies. So I would definitely try to write the tips separately. Once we have already seen the linguistic skills, we are going to focus now in more general type of adaptive material, which would be grammar and vocabulary activities. In this case, we normally tend to use a lot the intelligent boards and digital boards, blackboards. So it's important to have some strategies. If it happens, we use them. We need to explain everything we add in the blackboard, and we need to visually describing. So if we are writing it at the top or at the bottom, because that information might be important for the general understanding. And if our visually impaired student has low vision, it's advisable to give them the opportunity to stand up and move towards the blackboard or the board to see what we have written on it. When we work with vocabulary, it's important if we are working with very specific concepts to use some 3D models or realia. Okay, if these concepts are more abstract, the rest of the group has visual complementary images, I will recommend to give a list of this lexical set in advance, so our students, visually impaired students, will know what we are talking about in the class, in order not to feel lost during the process. Realia, it's great to be used, although sometimes it's difficult to take into the classes, but it's the best option, so they can totally connect the concept and the object. And well, we need to be careful with the vocabulary and the words we use to describe some grammar structures. We normally use some expressions like we move the subject to the beginning, to the middle of the sentence, and these expressions are very abstract to our visually impaired students. So in the next slide, I will commend you and I will explain some useful material and strategies in order to avoid this. In these images, you've got examples of both vocabulary and grammar adaptive material. Okay, in the first one, you've got some toys, objects, with in this case, I also included the name in Braille and on the paper, but it's an option that you can also not do. Okay. In the other case, you've got a grammar strategy that I like, call it the sentence builder. And well, it's created with movable cards in which its color represents different parts of the structure: subject, verb, and complement. And we can move, so when we talk on the board and we normally paint with arrows, the typical structure that we change from affirmative to question, for example, in which the subject, we move it to the middle of the sentence, it's that we move the card from the beginning of the board to the middle of the board, so they can understand how this process occurs on the board, but also in the grammar structure. But as I said, these are just examples, and well, you can, I'm sure you will find more strategies. Finally, in this adapting section, we are going to talk about how we can adapt projects. I know this type of activity is very used in foreign language classrooms, but we need to take into account some aspects when working with visually impaired students. Projects are normally done in groups, and they are a great activity to cooperate and to make collaborative tasks among students. However, we need to think, how are we going to include our visually impaired students if all the tasks and activities that we are going to ask during this project or are accessible for them, or if we need to adapt or we need to think of any specific activity for them. Some other projects are done online, and well, we need to think as well, how are we going to make this online process accessible. We should need to check if the online resources are accessible in advance, so we are sure that our visually impaired student can do the same activity as the rest of the group. And this is a very interesting point that I like to include, because we know that extra time for visually impaired students will be needed. However, that doesn't mean that the whole group will have extra time. This is something that we need to explain in advance, so they understand the difference and they understand why this person needs more time, but not the whole group. Because it can be a little bit difficult to understand why a group has more time or less time. So remember that the extra time is only for the visually impaired student in this case. Here you've got an example of a project activity, and I'm going to explain here how I would adapt it. As I have already said, remember, this is a possible adaptation, but it's not the only one. I will just give you some examples in order to make you think of the possibilities. So I would think of the color and contrast. In this case, the image has got a very disturbing background with different colors and different even elements on it. So I would check if this is accessible or not to our visually impaired students. The same happens with the circles in which all the content is included. Not even the circles have the same shape and size, so it can be difficult to understand why this difference is happening. But apart from that, it's even more difficult for them to follow the organization, as it's not in a clearly lined organization. So my recommendation would be to transcribe it in a different paper, writing the numbers and writing the information next to the numbers. But I would recommend you to avoid the arrows and movement along the paper and the page, because it can be very disturbing for them. Even for the low vision students, it's sometimes we think that with the enlargement of the image it's enough, and sometimes it's not. As I have already said, it's not only the enlargement, but it's how the image is organized. Well, I have already mentioned in the previous slide that I would recommend some specific resources or web pages that I have already checked the accessibility, so our student wouldn't feel frustrated in the process of the project.
Correction and feedback.
We arrive here at a very interesting part of this session, which is how we should give back decoration and feedback to our students. Well, it's something that we sometimes forget, and the most important, or one of the most important processes when we teach is to explain the mistakes in order to give the possibility to learn from them and, acquire the proper knowledge. So I have making here a difference between different types of visual impaired students. In this case, we're going to talk about low vision students or totally blind students, non-braille users or computer users. Okay, so in this case, talking about the low vision students who work with paper, with enlargement images, with enlarging images or documents, we can work with highlighting and underlining. This helps to focus very easily and very quickly the mistake, so they can identify on the document very easily where they have to pay attention to. We can also use some stickers for them to, again, to localize and to focus very easily where they have to, where the point they have to go in order to see the mistake. But the most important thing is that any explanation or any long correction that we make should be a part. They need, as I said, probably enlarging images or enlarging text, and we need to be as clean as possible. So any explanation, any commentary that we need to write, it's much better to do it in a different paper or in a different paragraph. If we work with low vision students, in this case, who work with computer, there are here some tips or strategies you might use. Again, highlighting and underlining in the text helps them to localize and find very easily the mistake. In this case, it's even much useful for them, much more useful for them, because we can choose the color of the highlighting. Of course, with paper as well, but with the computer, we can ask our students if they prefer one color or the other, because they can see it better or not. In this case, instead of working with the stickers, I recommend you to use some brackets and capital letters to write the correction in. Because it's very easy for them to see that a word is written with capital letters in the middle of a sentence or a text. They understand that something is different or something is wrong there. But this is very important. If we use this type of strategies, it's very important to set them at the beginning of the year so they can understand the way we correct. Okay. And the same with computer is even easier to make this. Any explanation or any longer correction, we should do it in separate paragraphs, because this helps them to understand everything better. Instead of having the correction, the whole explanation in the middle of the text, it's much better to do it in a separate way. When we work with Braille users who are totally blind students, we have as well some other strategies, as you can see here. But the most important thing is that with Braille, we don't have the option to write anything on the same text. So again, the explanations need to be done separately from the mistake. However, we can again use some stickers or some relief material to make them aware of the position of the mistake in the text. But here we have another problem that we might face, and it's when teachers don't know Braille, and this is something it's going to happen. Okay, so in this case, students should read their writing and even spell what they have written, so we can correct and we know everything they have commented or they have added in their writing activities. But we have also the other possibility, which is working with totally blind students who use technological devices. In this case, the correction, my recommendation is that if the correction is a word, just an isolated word, should be done immediately after the mistake. And as I have commented with low vision students, it's very useful to use brackets, and inside the brackets write in capital letters, because if they use, for example, the Braille display, they're going to find that something different is happening there, so they're going to be very focused on that appearance of that different sign, Braille sign, as it is the capital letters or the bracket sign. And well, it's very easily for them to find the mistake in the text. Okay, another possibility, if we want to make them part of the correction, it's to use a set of initials. So for example, we can work with a G in brackets for grammar mistakes, or a V for vocabulary mistakes. Again, my recommendation is to write that just before or after the mistake, but we should previously set that or establish that set of initials and the way of correcting to our students, so they know what they have to look for in the text. Okay, so here you've got some examples for different writing activities. The first one you can see it's a low vision student writing for primary, in which the document is enlarged, and as well are the images. And you can see the sticker at the second line, so they can identify the mistake underlined. And in the other example, you've got the highlighting word, the corrected word, so the student can identify with the color the mistake. But as I said, it's important to know if our student with low vision can see colors, or if they prefer one color or the other. So it's very, very important to try different strategies, try different options, and establish and set which is the most useful one. In the other example, you've got a Braille document with different answers. In this case, you can see a glue tack ball and a sticker. So when they are reading with their words, they can touch very easily where the mistake is. And then just under the sentence, I have added the correction. If you have space in the same paper, in the same page, it's perfect to do it there. So I have numbered the correction. So once they are touching and they are reading, they can say, okay, this is my first mistake, so I go to number 1 in the correction. This is my second, so I go to number 2. And it's very practical for them, so they everything is organized and they can identify very easily the mistake and the correction.
Tips for teaching visually impaired learners FL.
Well, and we arrived to the last part of this session, and also to the last part of the course. And we arrived to a very beautiful point in which I will try to summarize all the tips and strategies for teaching visually impaired learners, as well as I will try to give you some personal tips related to my experience in this aspect. Well, so here you've got some tips for teaching visually impaired learners, for teaching a second language. To visually impaired learners. In this case, I recommend you to gain a full understanding of our student visual impairment. We already said this in session number 1, but it will ease a lot our teaching process if we understand what each disability, what each disability determines in the learning process and how it affects the learning process. Something very related is to know how our students will access the material. So we need to know if they're going to work with computer, with enlargement of the document, if they're going to use Braille. It's really important to know this and to be consistent with that. Remember to check the accessibility of our classroom and not only the documents, okay, the space we are working, the space our students are going to work in. It's very important to be accessible and, well, a comfortable space for them. How are we going to set up tasks? Okay, we need to organize, simplify, and you've got here some considerations as well. So it's important to break down reading and listening tasks. We need to focus on the goal or the main objective of the activity and avoid some complementary information that maybe for non-visually impaired students is easy to understand the connection, but not so easy when we can't see. It's very useful as well to use some multisensory activities. We can use models, we can use 3D objects, realia. Those types of materials help to contextualize the learning. And remember to describe any image that is related to the activity, and that description should be done in their mother tongue so they have all the whole information which is essential for the process of the activity. And finally, we arrived to the last part and the last slide of this session and this course, in which I have wanted to summarize and make a brief overview of the most relevant tips or more personal tips that I want to share with you. The first one is to ask for advice. It's normal you feel overwhelmed. It's a challenge working with visually impaired students. So don't worry, ask for advice to your colleagues and even to your students, because you're going to find a lot of information in them. It's important to check the accessibility of the classroom and the material, not only at the beginning of the year or the first days we start working with visually impaired students, but also throughout the whole year. As we have already commented and discussed, impairments are very changing, and what is great for one day might not be for the other, so we need to check continuously this accessibility. It's a great opportunity for the rest of the group to be part of this accessibility process and to make like a cooperative atmosphere in which they can understand how they can help and how they can include as well these, in this case, visually impaired students. So it's great to try to make the rest of the partners feel part of this process. Of course, talk to your student or their family if they're under 8. It's really relevant to have as much information as possible, and they have a great amount of that. So don't doubt to ask even questions you might think are easy or simple. Ask them, talk to them. You're going to find the solution, and you're going to see it was not so difficult as you thought at the beginning. And finally, the most important thing and the most personal, of course, is that you have to believe in your students. Visually impaired students need more time, need adaptation, and they will need our guide, but they can achieve that communicative competence we are looking when teaching foreign language. So for sure, believe in your students. You're going to be amazed by them. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope this course has been interesting and useful for you. And for me, it's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you. Now, before we finish and we say goodbye, I invite you to access to this these different links in which you will find documents, examples, and even some accessible games that I invite you to play, because you will have the opportunity to assess and evaluate your knowledge about visually impaired students in the classroom. So, as I said, check all of them because there's a lot of interesting and useful information for you.
Thank you. Credits and copyright. Copyright symbol British Council 2025. Copyright symbol once 2025. All rights reserved. This publication is for teacher training purposes only and not for commercial use. If you wish to reproduce, scan, transmit or use this publication or any part of it for another purpose, please contact the British Council for written permission. DPO Spain at britishcouncil.es